The iron horse thundered across the endless prairie, its black smoke trailing behind like a dark ribbon against the pale blue sky of 1885. Inside the dusty passenger car, 22-year-old Lizzie Harper clutched her worn leather satchel and stared out the window at the rolling grasslands of Nebraska Territory. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. 3 weeks ago, she had been living in the crowded tenements of Boston, working 14-hour days in a textile factory for barely enough coins to buy stale bread. Now she was heading west to marry a man she'd never met, a rancher named Samuel Whitmore who had promised her a new life on the frontier. The mail-order bride business was common in those days. The American West was full of lonely men who needed wives, and the East was full of women who needed better lives. Newspapers carried advertisements from bachelors seeking brides, and marriage agencies helped connect them through letters. For many women like Lizzie, it was their only chance to escape poverty and start fresh. Lizzie smoothed her best dress, a simple blue cotton frock that had seen better days, and checked her reflection in the train window. Her auburn hair was pinned back neatly, and her green eyes held a mixture of hope and fear. In her satchel was everything she owned: 2 other dresses, her mother's silver locket, a few precious books, and most importantly, the letters from Samuel Whitmore. His letters had been kind and gentle, describing his cattle ranch near the small town of Silver Creek, Wyoming. He wrote about the wild horses that ran free across his land, the snow-capped mountains in the distance, and his dream of building a family. He seemed like a good man, even if she couldn't quite picture his face from his awkward description of himself as tall with brown hair and honest eyes. Next stop, Silver Creek, the conductor called out, startling Lizzie from her thoughts. Her stomach fluttered with butterflies. In just a few minutes, she would meet her future husband and begin her new life as a rancher's wife. She had read books about the West, stories of cowboys and cattle drives, of harsh winters and dangerous outlaws. But those were just stories. This was real life. The train began to slow, its brakes squealing against the metal wheels. Through the window, Lizzie could see the small town of Silver Creek coming into view. It wasn't much to look at, just a main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple pointing toward the sky, and dusty roads that led off toward the surrounding ranch lands. As the train pulled into the station, Lizzie gathered her courage and stood up. Her legs felt wobbly, but she forced herself to walk toward the exit. Other passengers were already getting off: a few businessmen in suits, a family with young children, and an elderly woman carrying a basket of chickens. Lizzie stepped down onto the wooden platform and looked around nervously. Samuel had written that he would meet her at the station, but she wasn't sure which of the men waiting there might be him. There was a tall man in a black coat smoking a pipe, a shorter fellow with a thick beard, and Miss Harper. She turned toward the voice and saw a young man approaching her. He was indeed tall, with brown hair peeking out from under his worn cowboy hat. But something was wrong. He looked younger than she had expected, and there was something different about his eyes. They weren't the calm, steady eyes of a settled rancher, but the restless, alert eyes of someone always watching for trouble. "Yes, I'm Elizabeth Harper," she said carefully. I'm here to meet you," the young man said, removing his hat politely. "There's been a bit of a change in plans." Lizzie's heart sank. "What do you mean? Where is Mr. Whitmore?" The young man glanced around nervously as if he expected someone to be watching. "My name's Jake Morrison. Samuel. Mr. Whitmore asked me to meet you. He's been delayed." Something in his tone made Lizzie suspicious. This wasn't how she had imagined her arrival would go. "Delayed how? And who are you exactly?" Jake Morrison ran his hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable. "I work for Samuel. Sort of. Look, Miss Harper, it's complicated, and this isn't the place to explain. Let me get your bags and we'll head out to the ranch. Samuel will explain everything when you see him." Before Lizzie could protest, Jake had picked up her small trunk from where the porter had set it on the platform. He walked quickly toward a wagon hitched to 2 horses, leaving her little choice but to follow. As they rode out of town, Lizzie studied her mysterious escort. Jake Morrison didn't look like any ranch hand she had imagined. His clothes were well made, though dusty from travel. His horse, a beautiful black stallion that seemed too expensive for a common cowboy, was tied behind the wagon. And there was something about the way he kept scanning the horizon, as if he expected trouble to appear at any moment. "How long have you worked for Mr. Whitmore?" Lizzie asked, trying to learn more about her situation. "Not long," Jake replied shortly. "He's a good man, though. You'll like him." "Then why isn't he here to meet me himself? A man who sends for a bride should have the courtesy to greet her when she arrives." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Sometimes things don't go according to plan out here, Miss Harper. The West can be unpredictable. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking as they traveled along a dirt road that wound between rolling hills covered in prairie grass. In the distance, Lizzie could see cattle grazing peacefully, and she began to relax a little. Maybe this Jake Morrison was just shy, and there really was an innocent explanation for Samuel's absence. But as they crested a hill, Jake suddenly pulled the horses to a stop. His hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip, and his eyes narrowed as he stared at something ahead. "What is it?" Lizzie asked, following his gaze. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from what looked like a cluster of buildings. But it wasn't the friendly smoke of cooking fires or chimneys. This smoke was black and thick, the kind that came from things that weren't supposed to be burning. "Stay in the wagon," Jake said grimly, but Lizzie could see the worry in his eyes. "No matter what happens, stay in the wagon." He urged the horses forward, and as they got closer, Lizzie's heart began to race. The buildings ahead were indeed on fire, and they looked like they might be the buildings of the ranch where she was supposed to start her new life. The Whitmore Ranch was a scene of devastation. 3 buildings were ablaze: the main house, the barn, and what looked like a bunkhouse where the ranch hands would have slept. Black smoke billowed into the afternoon sky, and the air was filled with the smell of burning wood and something else that made Lizzie's stomach turn. Jake brought the wagon to a halt at a safe distance from the flames. His face had gone pale, and he was gripping the reins so tightly that his knuckles were white. "Samuel," he shouted, jumping down from the wagon. "Samuel, are you there?" There was no answer except for the crackling of the flames and the frightened lowing of cattle in the distance. Jake started toward the burning buildings, but the heat drove him back. "We need to get help," Lizzie said, her voice shaking. "We need to get the sheriff or the fire brigade or—" "There is no fire brigade out here," Jake said grimly. "And the sheriff? Well, that's complicated too." Before Lizzie could ask what he meant, they heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Jake's hand immediately went to his gun, and he stepped in front of the wagon, shielding Lizzie from whatever was coming. 3 riders appeared over the ridge, moving fast. As they got closer, Lizzie could see they were rough-looking men wearing long coats and wide-brimmed hats pulled low over their faces. The leader was a large man with a thick black beard and cold, dark eyes. "Well, well," the bearded man called out as he reined in his horse. "If it isn't Jake Morrison. We've been looking for you, boy." "Caleb Black," Jake replied, his voice steady but tense. "I should have known you'd be behind this." So this was Caleb Black, and even Lizzie, new to the West as she was, had heard that name whispered in fearful tones during her train journey. Black was one of the most notorious outlaws in the territory, leader of a gang that robbed banks, rustled cattle, and killed anyone who got in their way. "Where's Whitmore?" Black asked, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. "I don't know," Jake replied truthfully. "I came back and found the place like this." Black laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "You're a terrible liar, Morrison. We know he's been hiding something here. Something that belongs to us." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't." Black's gaze shifted to Lizzie, who was trying to make herself as small as possible in the wagon seat. "And who might this pretty lady be?" "She's a bit overdressed for ranch work." Jake stepped closer to the wagon, his hand still resting on his gun. "She's nobody. Just a visitor." "A visitor?" Black repeated mockingly. "Way out here? That's interesting." He studied Lizzie with those cold eyes. "You wouldn't happen to be that mail-order bride Whitmore was expecting, would you, miss?" Lizzie's heart nearly stopped. How did this outlaw know about that? She opened her mouth to answer, but Jake spoke first. "Like I said, she's nobody important." "Oh, I think she's very important," Black said with a cruel smile. "I think Samuel Whitmore would do just about anything to keep a pretty lady safe. Wouldn't he, boys?" The other 2 outlaws chuckled and moved their horses closer to the wagon. Lizzie could see they were both armed with multiple guns, and they had the hard, dangerous look of men who had killed before. "Let her go, Black," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your fight is with me and Whitmore, not with her." "My fight is with whoever I say it's with," Black replied. He nodded to his men. "Take the girl." What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. Jake drew his gun with lightning speed, faster than Lizzie would have believed possible. At the same time he shouted, "Get down," and threw himself toward the wagon. The clearing exploded with gunfire. Jake's first shot took down one of Black's men before the outlaw could even clear his holster. Black and the remaining man returned fire, their bullets splintering the wood of the wagon seat just inches from where Lizzie had ducked down. Jake rolled behind the wagon and came up firing again. His second shot grazed Black's arm, causing the outlaw leader to curse and wheel his horse away from the fight. "This isn't over, Morrison," Black shouted as he and his remaining man rode hard toward the hills. "We'll find what Whitmore's hiding, and when we do, you'll all pay." The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the crackling of the still-burning buildings. Jake slowly stood up, his gun still in his hand, and looked around carefully to make sure they were really gone. "Are you hurt?" he asked Lizzie, who was still crouched in the wagon with her hands over her head. She looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Who are you?" she whispered. "And don't tell me you're just a ranch hand, because I've seen how ranch hands handle guns and they don't shoot like that." Jake holstered his weapon and ran his hand through his hair again, a gesture Lizzie was beginning to recognize as something he did when he was nervous or thinking hard. "My name really is Jake Morrison," he said finally. "But you're right, I'm not a ranch hand. I'm a U.S. Marshal." The revelation hit Lizzie like a physical blow. A U.S. Marshal? That meant Jake Morrison was a federal lawman, one of the elite peace officers who chased the worst criminals across territorial lines. But if that was true, then what was he doing here, and where was Samuel Whitmore? "I don't understand," she said, climbing down from the wagon on shaking legs. "If you're a marshal, then why? Where is my husband-to-be? What's happened to Samuel?" Jake looked toward the still-burning buildings, his jaw tight with anger and something that might have been grief. "Samuel Whitmore is dead, Miss Harper. He was murdered 3 days ago." The words hit Lizzie like cold water. She sank down onto a nearby rock, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "Dead? But how? Why?" "Because he was helping me," Jake said quietly. "And because of that, Caleb Black's gang killed him." The full scope of her situation began to dawn on Lizzie. She was alone in the middle of the Wyoming territory with no money, no place to go, and apparently in the middle of some kind of war between a federal marshal and one of the most dangerous outlaw gangs in the West. "I need to understand what's happening here," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "If I'm in danger, and it certainly seems like I am, then I deserve to know why." Jake nodded, recognizing the steel in her voice despite her circumstances. "You're right. But first we need to get away from here. Black and his men will be back, probably with reinforcements. And when they come back, they won't be interested in taking prisoners." He helped her back into the wagon and climbed up beside her. As they drove away from the burning ranch, Jake began to tell her the whole story. 6 months ago," he said, "Caleb Black's gang robbed the Union Pacific Railroad outside of Cheyenne. They got away with $50,000 in gold coins that were being shipped to banks in California. But during their escape, something went wrong. The gang split up, and Black ended up hiding the gold somewhere in this area. Why didn't he just come back for it later?" "Because I was tracking him," Jake explained. "I'd been on Black's trail for over a year, ever since he and his gang killed a family of settlers near Denver. When I got close to catching him after the train robbery, he had to run without the gold. He's been trying to get back to it ever since, but I've been watching this whole territory." "And Samuel Whitmore was helping you?" Jake's expression darkened. "Samuel was a good man who believed in doing the right thing. When I told him I was tracking Black's gang, he offered to let me use his ranch as a base of operations. He said he'd tell people I was working for him as a ranch hand. But something went wrong. Black must have figured out what we were doing. 3 days ago, when I was in town getting supplies, Black's gang attacked the ranch. They tortured Samuel, trying to make him tell them where I was and what I knew about the hidden gold. When he wouldn't talk." Jake's voice trailed off. Lizzie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "They killed him. I found his body when I got back. I buried him on the hill behind the ranch, next to his wife. She died of fever 2 years ago, that's why he sent for a mail-order bride. He was lonely." They rode in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. In the distance, coyotes were beginning their evening song, a mournful howling that seemed to match Lizzie's mood. "So what happens now?" she asked finally. "I suppose you'll put me on the next train back east." Jake glanced at her with surprise. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't seem to matter much," Lizzie replied bitterly. "I came out here to marry a man who's dead. I have no money, no job, and nowhere to go. And apparently I'm being hunted by outlaws who think I'm important to their plans somehow." "You could go back east," Jake said carefully. "I could probably scrape together enough money for a train ticket." "Probably?" Lizzie looked at him sharply. "You mean you don't have the money either?" "U.S. Marshals don't get paid much," Jake admitted. "Most of what I had went to buying supplies and keeping my horse fed. I was planning to collect the bounty on Black's gang to get by. So they were both broke, both alone, and both in danger. Lizzie found herself laughing, though it wasn't really funny. This is quite a situation we're in, Marshal Morrison. Call me Jake, he said with a slight smile. And yes, it's complicated. But I have a plan. Which is? Black thinks you're important to Samuel and Samuel is dead. But Black doesn't know Samuel is dead. I buried him before anyone else found out. If Black thinks Samuel is still alive and hiding somewhere, he'll try to use me to force Samuel to come out of hiding, Lizzie finished, understanding immediately. You want to use me as bait? Not exactly. I want Black to think he's using you as bait, while we're actually using the situation to trap him and his gang. It was a dangerous plan and they both knew it. But as they talked about it while the wagon rolled through the gathering darkness, Lizzie found herself agreeing to it. She had come west looking for a new life, and while this wasn't what she had expected, it was certainly an adventure. Besides, she found herself thinking as she glanced at the handsome young marshal beside her, there were worse fates than being stranded in the wilderness with a brave lawman who was fighting for justice. If only she could be sure that justice would win in the end. By the time they reached Silver Creek, it was full dark. The small frontier town looked different at night, more mysterious, with warm yellow light spilling from windows and the sound of piano music drifting from the saloon. But Lizzie could also see armed men standing in shadows, and she noticed how Jake's hand stayed near his gun as they drove down the main street. Is this town safe? She asked quietly. Safer than being out on the range, Jake replied, but that's not saying much. Some of the people here are good folks just trying to make a living. Others. He nodded toward a group of rough-looking men lounging outside the saloon. Others ask too many questions and give too few answers. They pulled up in front of a modest two-story building with a sign reading Silver Creek Hotel. It wasn't fancy, but it looked clean and respectable. Jake helped Lizzie down from the wagon and carried her small trunk inside. The hotel lobby was small but comfortable, with a few chairs arranged around a pot-bellied stove and a front desk where a middle-aged woman sat reading a book by lamplight. She looked up as they entered, and Lizzie saw her eyes take in their dusty clothes and travel-worn appearance. We need 2 rooms, Jake said, stepping up to the desk. 2. The woman, presumably Mrs. Henderson, according to the sign on the desk, looked between Jake and Lizzie with curiosity. Are you folks married? No, ma'am, Jake said firmly. The lady needs a room for the night. I'll take whatever you have available. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly, but she was too polite to ask more questions. That'll be $2 for both rooms, including breakfast in the morning. Jake paid the money, though Lizzie could see it was a significant portion of what he had left. She made a mental note to repay him somehow when this was all over, assuming they both lived through whatever was coming next. Mrs. Henderson, Jake said as the hotel owner handed them their room keys, you haven't seen any strangers in town today, have you? Men who might have been asking questions about the Whitmore Ranch. The woman's expression grew cautious. Are you expecting trouble, Mr. Morrison? And I hope not, but it's better to be prepared. There were 3 men who came through around supper time, Mrs. Henderson admitted. They had a drink at the saloon and asked Tom Brady about ranches in the area. Tom didn't much like their attitude from what I heard. Jake and Lizzie exchanged glances. 3 men, that would be Caleb Black and his 2 remaining gang members. Thank you, ma'am. We appreciate the information. As they climbed the narrow stairs to their rooms, Jake spoke quietly to Lizzie. I want you to lock your door and don't open it for anyone but me. If you hear shooting or any kind of commotion, get under the bed and stay there until I come for you. What about you? Where will you be? I need to talk to a few people, find out what Black and his men are up to. I won't be gone long. Lizzie's room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out onto the main street. She set her satchel on the bed and went to the window, pulling the curtain aside slightly so she could watch the street below. She saw Jake emerge from the hotel and walk across to the saloon. Even from a distance, she could see the confident way he carried himself, the way his eyes constantly scanned for danger. He really was quite handsome, she found herself thinking, with his tall frame and those alert, intelligent eyes. But then she caught herself. What was she doing, thinking about Jake Morrison that way? She had come to Wyoming to marry Samuel Whitmore, and even though Samuel was dead, it seemed wrong to be having romantic thoughts about another man so soon. Although, she reminded herself, she had never actually met Samuel. Their relationship had existed only in letters. She had been prepared to marry him out of necessity and hope, not love. With Jake, she was beginning to feel something quite different, something that made her heart race when he looked at her with those serious brown eyes. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Harper? It's me, Jake." She opened the door to find the marshal looking grim. "What did you find out?" "Black's men are still in town. They're asking a lot of questions about Samuel Whitmore and whether anyone has seen him recently. So far, nobody's told them anything useful, but it's only a matter of time." "What do we do?" Jake stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "We're going to give them what they want to hear. Tomorrow morning you're going to let yourself be seen around town. You're going to act like you're Samuel Whitmore's new bride, and you're going to seem worried because your husband hasn't come to meet you. And then we wait for Black to make his move. When he tries to kidnap you to force Samuel out of hiding, I'll be ready for him." It sounded simple when he said it like that, but Lizzie could see the worry in Jake's eyes. This plan depended on a lot of things going right, and in her short experience with the West, she had already learned that things rarely went according to plan. He stepped closer to her, close enough that she could smell the leather and sage scent of him, close enough to see the golden flecks in his brown eyes. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said firmly. "I promise you that. I've never lost anyone I was protecting, and I'm not going to start with you." The intensity in his voice made her believe him, but it also made her realize something else. The way he was looking at her, the way he had stepped closer, the way his voice had dropped to that low, intimate tone, Jake Morrison was starting to care about her as more than just someone he was duty-bound to protect. And she was starting to care about him the same way. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it gave her courage. If they were going to face danger together tomorrow, at least they wouldn't be facing it alone. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp air that made everything seem possible. Lizzie dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a green cotton frock that brought out her eyes, and pinned her auburn hair up in a style that was both proper and becoming. When she came down to the hotel dining room for breakfast, she found Jake already there, sitting at a corner table where he could see both the front door and the window that looked out onto the street. He stood politely as she approached, and she noticed he had cleaned up as well. With his hair combed and his shirt pressed, he looked every inch the respectable gentleman, except for the gun at his hip and the watchful way his eyes never stopped moving. "Good morning, Miss Harper," he said formally, loud enough for Mrs. Henderson to hear from behind the counter. "I trust you slept well?" "As well as could be expected, considering," Lizzie replied, playing her part. "I'm quite worried about my Samuel. It's not like him to be late for such an important occasion." Mrs. Henderson brought them coffee and plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. The food was simple but well prepared, and Lizzie realized she was hungrier than she had thought. The stress and excitement of the last 2 days had left her barely eating. "I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation," Jake said, continuing their performance. "Perhaps he was delayed by ranch business." As they ate, Lizzie became aware that they were being watched. A man sitting at a table near the window kept glancing in their direction, and she was pretty sure he was one of the men she had seen with Caleb Black the day before. He was trying to look casual, but there was something about the way he held himself that reminded her of a predator watching its prey. Jake had noticed him too. Without seeming to, he positioned himself so that he could see both the man at the window and the front door. His right hand rested casually near his gun, and Lizzie could sense the tension coiled in his muscles like a spring ready to snap. "I think I'll walk around town a bit," Lizzie said, finishing her breakfast. "Perhaps someone has seen Samuel or knows where he might be." "That's a good idea," Jake agreed. "I have some business to take care of myself. Shall we meet back here for lunch?" They were putting on quite a show, Lizzie thought. To anyone watching, they would look like exactly what they were pretending to be, a mail-order bride and a helpful ranch hand, both concerned about the missing bridegroom. Lizzie left the hotel and began walking down the main street of Silver Creek. The town was coming alive for the day, with shopkeepers opening their doors and women heading to the general store for supplies. Children ran between the buildings, playing games and laughing, while men in work clothes headed out to their various jobs. It was actually quite a pleasant little town, Lizzie thought. Under different circumstances, she might have been happy to make a life here. The people seemed friendly enough, and there was a sense of community that she had missed in the anonymous crowds of Boston. She stopped at the general store and spoke with the proprietor, a kindly man named Mr. Johnson. "I'm Elizabeth Harper," she told him. "I'm supposed to be meeting Samuel Whitmore. He's my intended husband. You wouldn't happen to have seen him recently, would you?" Mr. Johnson's face grew concerned. "Samuel Whitmore? Why, miss, I haven't seen Samuel in over a week. That's unusual for him. He usually comes to town for supplies every few days." "I'm getting quite worried," Lizzie said, letting genuine concern show in her voice. It wasn't hard, since she was genuinely concerned, not about Samuel but about what Caleb Black might try next. "Have you been out to his ranch?" Mr. Johnson asked. There seems to have been some trouble there. We saw smoke." "Smoke?" The storekeeper looked alarmed. "What kind of trouble?" Before Lizzie could answer, she became aware of a presence behind her. She turned to see a large man with a black beard standing in the doorway of the store. It was Caleb Black himself, and up close he was even more intimidating than he had been the day before. "Excuse me, miss," Black said in a voice that was polite on the surface but had an undercurrent of menace. "I couldn't help but overhear. You're looking for Samuel Whitmore?" "Yes," Lizzie replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm his fiancée, Elizabeth Harper." "Caleb Black," the outlaw introduced himself, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy. "I'm something of a business associate of Samuel's. Perhaps I could help you find him." Mr. Johnson looked uncomfortable with Black's presence, and Lizzie could see why. Even trying to be polite, the outlaw radiated danger like heat from a forge. "That's very kind of you," Lizzie said carefully. "But I'm sure Samuel will turn up soon. He's probably just been delayed by ranch business." "Oh, I don't think so," Black said with that cold smile she remembered from the day before. "You see, Miss Harper, I think Samuel might be in some serious trouble. The kind of trouble where a man might need to disappear for a while." The implication was clear. Black was letting her know that he was involved in Samuel's disappearance, and that he had plans for her as well. "I don't know what you mean," Lizzie said, but she let a note of fear creep into her voice. It wasn't hard, she was genuinely afraid. "Don't you?" Black stepped closer, and Lizzie could smell whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "I think you know more than you're saying, Miss Harper. I think Samuel told you things. Important things." I don't know what you're talking about." Black's eyes grew cold and hard. "Maybe we should discuss this somewhere more private. My men and I have a camp outside town. Very quiet. Very secluded." It was a threat, plain and simple. Lizzie's heart began to race, and she looked around desperately for Jake. But she couldn't see him anywhere on the street. "I really should be getting back to the hotel," she said, trying to edge toward the door. Black's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was like iron, and Lizzie couldn't hide a gasp of pain. "I don't think so," Black said quietly. "I think you're coming with me." Mr. Johnson started to protest, but one look from Black's cold eyes silenced him. The storekeeper was a good man, but he wasn't a fighter, and everyone in the room knew it. Black began to pull Lizzie toward the door, and she realized with growing panic that Jake's plan was working too well. Black was indeed trying to kidnap her, but Jake was nowhere to be seen. She was on her own. "Let her go, Black." Jake Morrison stood in the middle of the dusty street, his feet planted wide and his hand hovering over his gun. The morning sun was behind him, making him look like a figure from one of the dime novels Lizzie had read back east. Well, Black said, though he didn't release Lizzie's wrist. "If it isn't the famous Jake Morrison. I was wondering when you'd show yourself. Now you know. Let the lady go and we'll settle this between us." Black laughed. "I don't think so, Marshal. This lady is my insurance policy. Samuel Whitmore cares about her, and Samuel has something that belongs to me." "Samuel Whitmore is dead," Jake said flatly. "I killed him 3 days ago." The words hung in the morning air like a thunderclap. Lizzie stared at Jake in shock, and even Caleb Black looked surprised. "You killed him?" Black said slowly. "He was getting in the way of my investigation," Jake replied coldly. "I'm not a marshal, Black. I never was. I'm working for the railroad, and I want that 50,000 in gold as much as you do." Lizzie felt the world spinning around her. What was Jake saying? Was this part of some plan, or had he been lying to her all along? But then she saw something in Jake's eyes, a quick glance that seemed to say, "Trust me," and she realized what he was doing. He was trying to confuse Black, to make the outlaw think he was also after the gold. "Interesting," Black said, but his grip on Lizzie's wrist loosened slightly. "If that's true, then maybe we can make a deal." "Maybe we can," Jake agreed. "But first let the lady go. She's just a mail-order bride who got caught up in something she doesn't understand." "How do I know you won't shoot me the minute I release her?" Jake smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Because I want that gold, Black. And you're the only one who knows where it is." For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the dusty street. Lizzie could feel the tension building like the air before a thunderstorm. Everyone on the street had stopped what they were doing to watch, sensing that something important was about to happen. Then Black made his decision. He released Lizzie's wrist and pushed her away from him. "Run along, little lady," he said mockingly. "The menfolk have business to discuss." Lizzie stumbled backward, rubbing her wrist where Black had gripped it. She looked at Jake, trying to understand what he wanted her to do, but his attention was entirely focused on the outlaw leader. "Now then," Black said, his hand resting on the butt of his gun, "let's talk about that gold." But Jake had no intention of talking. His hand moved with lightning speed, and his Colt .45 cleared leather faster than Lizzie's eyes could follow. The street exploded into chaos. Black was fast, faster than most men, but Jake was faster. His first shot caught Black in the shoulder, spinning the outlaw leader around. Black's own gun discharged wildly into the air as he fell against the hitching post outside the general store. But Black wasn't alone. His two remaining gang members came running from the saloon, their guns already drawn. Jake dove to the side as bullets whistled through the air where he had been standing, rolling behind a water trough and coming up firing. "Get inside," Jake shouted to Lizzie, who was standing frozen in the doorway of the general store. "Everyone get inside." The townspeople scattered like leaves in a windstorm, diving for cover behind buildings and slamming doors. Mr. Johnson grabbed Lizzie's arm and pulled her deeper into his store, away from the windows where flying bullets might find them. Outside, the gun battle continued. Jake had found good cover behind the water trough, but the two outlaws were trying to flank him from both sides. One moved along the boardwalk in front of the buildings, using the wooden posts that held up the overhangs for cover. The other circled around behind the barber shop, trying to get a clear shot at Jake's back. Lizzie watched through the store window, her heart pounding with fear for Jake's safety. She could see Caleb Black struggling to get back on his feet despite his wounded shoulder, his face twisted with rage and pain. "He's outnumbered," she whispered to Mr. Johnson. "We have to help him." "I'm not a fighting man, miss," the storekeeper replied, though she could see he felt bad about it. "That marshal will have to handle this himself." But Jake was handling it. As the outlaw on the boardwalk leaned around a post to take aim, Jake's bullet caught him center mass and sent him crashing through the window of the dress shop. The man didn't get back up. The second outlaw, seeing his partner fall, made a desperate charge from behind the barber shop. He came around the corner firing rapidly, but his shots were wild and panicked. Jake remained calm, took careful aim, and put the man down with a single shot. Now it was just Jake and Caleb Black, and Black was wounded and furious. "You killed my boys," Black roared, using his good arm to steady his gun. "I'm going to put you in the ground, Morrison." "Your boys chose their side," Jake replied, rising from behind the water trough. "Same as you did." The two men faced each other in the middle of the street like something out of a Wild West show. But this wasn't entertainment. This was life and death. Black fired first, but his wounded shoulder threw off his aim. The bullet kicked up dust at Jake's feet. Jake's return shot was more accurate, catching Black in the chest and sending him backward into the dirt. The outlaw leader lay still for a moment and Lizzie thought it was over. But then Black started laughing, a horrible rasping sound that made her skin crawl. You think this ends it?" Black gasped, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "There's more of us, more coming. The gold? The gold will never be yours." "Where is it, Black?" Jake asked, standing over the dying outlaw. "Tell me where you hid the gold." But Caleb Black's eyes had already gone glassy and still. Whatever secrets he had carried about the location of the stolen railroad gold had died with him. Jake holstered his gun and looked around at the aftermath of the gunfight. 3 men were dead, and the street was littered with broken glass and splintered wood. The peaceful morning in Silver Creek had been shattered, possibly forever. "Is it over?" Lizzie asked, emerging from the general store. "For now," Jake replied, but his expression was troubled. "Black said there were more of them coming. We may have won this battle, but the war isn't over." That afternoon, while the town buried Caleb Black and his men in the local cemetery, Jake and Lizzie sat in the hotel dining room making plans. The shootout had established Jake's reputation in Silver Creek. Everyone now knew he was a U.S. Marshal, and they treated him with the respect and fear that such a position commanded in those days. "I've been thinking about what Black said," Jake told Lizzie over cups of coffee. "About more men coming. He wouldn't have said that unless it was true. How many more do you think there are?" "Hard to say. Black's gang has been operating for over 2 years. Even if most of them were killed or captured during that time, there could be a dozen men still loyal to him scattered across the territory." Lizzie stirred sugar into her coffee, thinking hard. "Jake, what if we could find the gold before the rest of Black's gang gets here? Wouldn't that change everything?" "It might. But we don't have any idea where to look." That gold could be buried anywhere within 100 miles of here. Maybe not, Lizzie said slowly. I've been thinking about what you told me, about how Black hid the gold when you were chasing him. Where would a man on the run hide something heavy like a bag of gold coins? Jake leaned forward, interested. Go on. He wouldn't have time to dig a deep hole, and he wouldn't want to carry it very far from where he was already going. So it would have to be somewhere close to a trail or a road, but hidden enough that casual travelers wouldn't stumble across it. That's good thinking. But there are still dozens of places that would fit that description. But how many of them are places where Black would feel safe returning to retrieve the gold later? Remember, he knew you were tracking him. He would have chosen somewhere he was familiar with, somewhere he had allies or at least people who wouldn't ask questions. Jake's eyes lit up with understanding. The old mining camps. There are 3 or 4 abandoned gold mines in the hills east of here. Places where desperate men still gather sometimes, men who don't ask questions about a person's past. Exactly. And if Black was familiar with this area, familiar enough to know about Samuel's ranch, then he probably knew about those mining camps too. It was the best lead they had and they both knew it. But it was also dangerous. If they were right about Black's remaining gang members coming to the area, the abandoned mining camps would be exactly the kind of places those men would use as hideouts. It's risky, Jake said. If we're wrong, we'll be wandering around the wilderness while Black's men are planning their next move. And if we're right, we might walk right into a trap, Lizzie finished. I understand. But Jake, what choice do we have? We can't just sit here waiting for them to come to us. Jake studied her face for a long moment. You don't have to come with me, you know. You could stay here in town where it's safer. Mrs. Henderson would look after you. And then what? Even if you find the gold and capture the rest of Black's gang, what happens to me? I still don't have any money, any way to get back east, any way to make a living. She was right and they both knew it. The hard truth was that frontier life didn't offer many options for a woman alone, especially a woman without family or resources. Besides, Lizzie added with a small smile, I'm starting to think I might be good at this adventure business. I did help you figure out where to look for the gold, didn't I? Jake couldn't argue with that. And if he was being honest with himself, he didn't want to leave her behind. Over the past few days, Elizabeth Harper had shown herself to be brave, intelligent, and resourceful. More than that, he was beginning to care about her in a way that had nothing to do with his duty as a marshal. All right, he said finally. But we do this carefully and we do it my way. At the first sign of serious trouble, I want your promise that you'll do exactly what I tell you, even if that means running away and leaving me behind. I promise, Lizzie said, though they both suspected she might not keep that promise if it came down to it. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for their expedition into the hills. Jake bought supplies at the general store, food, ammunition, and camping gear. Lizzie traded her fancy dresses for more practical clothing. Men's pants, a sturdy shirt, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the sun. You look like a real frontier woman, Jake told her approvingly when she emerged from the hotel wearing her new outfit. I feel like a different person, Lizzie replied, and it was true. The practical clothes made her feel stronger, more capable. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt like she might actually belong in the West. They left Silver Creek early the next morning, riding horses that Jake had rented from the local stable. Lizzie had learned to ride as a child before her family's financial troubles had forced them to move to the city, and she was pleased to discover that she hadn't forgotten how. The country east of Silver Creek was beautiful but harsh, rolling hills covered with sagebrush and scattered pine trees, with rocky outcroppings that rose like ancient monuments from the earth. In the distance, snow-capped mountains reached toward the sky, their peaks lost in morning clouds. The first mining camp is about 10 miles from here, Jake told her as they rode. It was called Lucky Strike, though from what I've heard, there wasn't much luck involved. The miners worked for 3 years and barely found enough gold to pay for their supplies. What happened to them? Most gave up and moved on. A few stayed in the area trying their luck at different claims. And some. Jake's expression grew serious. Some turned to other ways of making money. Robbing travelers, rustling cattle, that sort of thing. The kind of men who might be willing to work for someone like Caleb Black. Exactly. As they rode deeper into the hills, Jake taught Lizzie things that no finishing school in Boston had ever covered. He showed her how to read the signs that other riders had passed through, broken twigs, disturbed rocks, horse droppings that could tell you how long ago the horses had been there. He taught her how to listen to the sounds of the wilderness, how to distinguish between the call of a hawk and the whistle that men sometimes used to signal each other, how the sudden silence of birds could mean that strangers were approaching. Most importantly, he taught her how to shoot. "I've never held a gun before," Lizzie admitted when Jake handed her a small revolver during their noon rest. "Then it's time you learned," Jake replied. "Out here, knowing how to defend yourself isn't just useful, it's necessary for survival." The gun felt heavy and dangerous in her hands, but Jake was a patient teacher. He showed her how to hold it properly, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger slowly and steadily rather than jerking it. Her first few shots went wide, kicking up dirt yards away from the tin cans Jake had set up as targets. But gradually she began to get the feel of it. By the time they were ready to move on, she had managed to hit 2 of the cans. "Not bad for a beginner," Jake said approvingly. "Remember, if you ever have to use this for real, don't think too much. Trust your instincts and shoot to stop the threat." They reached the first abandoned mining camp, Lucky Strike, just as the sun was beginning to set. It was a desolate place, with tumble-down buildings and mining equipment that was slowly rusting away. Weeds grew between the buildings, and the only sounds were the wind whistling through broken windows and the occasional scurry of some small animal. "Doesn't look like anyone's been here recently," Lizzie observed. Jake dismounted and examined the ground carefully. "Actually, someone has been here. Look at these boot prints, they're not more than a week old. And see how the dust has been disturbed around that old cabin? Someone's been using it." They approached the cabin cautiously with Jake's gun drawn and ready. But it was empty except for some old blankets and the remains of recent cooking fires. "They're gone," Jake said, relaxing slightly. "But they were here. The question is whether they found what they were looking for." They searched the area around the camp as thoroughly as they could in the fading light, looking for any sign of recently disturbed earth that might indicate where gold had been buried and dug up. But they found nothing. "We'll camp here tonight," Jake decided. "Tomorrow we'll check the other mining camps." As darkness fell over the abandoned camp, they built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and bacon. The flames danced cheerfully, providing warmth and light in the vast wilderness, but Lizzie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Jake," she said quietly, "do you think Black's men know we're out here?" "It's possible," he replied, adding wood to the fire. "But if they do, there's not much we can do about it except stay alert and be ready for trouble." They took turns keeping watch during the night, and when morning came they were both tired but unharmed. After a quick breakfast, they packed up their camp and rode toward the second mining site. This one was called Fool's Gold, and it was larger than Lucky Strike, with more buildings and what had once been a more elaborate mining operation. But like the first camp, it appeared to have been recently abandoned. "Look at this," Jake called, examining the ground near what had once been the main mining shaft. Lizzie joined him and saw what he had found, a large area where the earth had been disturbed as if someone had been digging. But the digging had been filled in again, and grass was already beginning to grow over the disturbed soil. "This could be it," she said excitedly. Jake knelt down and began clearing away the loose dirt with his hands. A few inches down, his fingers encountered something hard and metallic. "Well, I'll be," he breathed. Working together, they cleared away more dirt and revealed a metal strongbox, the kind used by banks and railroad companies to transport valuables. But when Jake pried it open with his knife, they found it empty except for a note written in a crude hand. "Too late, Marshall. The gold is ours now. If you want it back, come to Devil's Canyon alone. Bring the girl." It was signed with a simple B, presumably for one of Black's remaining gang members. "It's a trap," Jake said grimly. "Of course it's a trap," Lizzie replied. "The question is, are we going to walk into it?" Jake looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "You know, Miss Harper, when you first stepped off that train, I never would have guessed you'd turn out to be this brave." "Neither would I," Lizzie admitted. "But I'm learning that people can be more than they think they are when circumstances require it." As they studied the note and made plans for what to do next, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from the rocks above the mining camp, a man with a rifle and cold eyes who had been waiting for them to find exactly what they had found. The trap was already closing around them. Devil's Canyon was well named. It was a narrow gorge carved deep into the rocky hills, with sheer walls that rose 100 feet on either side. The only way in or out was through the narrow entrance, which made it perfect for an ambush but terrible for anyone trying to escape. Jake and Lizzie approached the canyon carefully, leaving their horses tied to a stunted pine tree about half a mile away. If they needed to make a quick getaway, they didn't want to waste time untying and mounting their horses. "I still think this is a bad idea," Jake said for the 10th time as they crept closer to the canyon entrance. "We should go back to town and get help." "Help from who?" Lizzie replied practically. Silver Creek doesn't have a sheriff, and the nearest army post is 3 days' ride away. By the time we could get back with reinforcements, Black's men would be long gone with the gold. She was right and Jake knew it. But that didn't make him feel any better about walking into what was obviously a trap. They reached the mouth of the canyon and peered inside. The walls were high and steep, casting deep shadows even though it was the middle of the day. About halfway back into the gorge, they could see the remains of what had once been another mining operation. A few wooden buildings and the dark mouth of a mine shaft carved into the rock wall. "I see horses," Jake whispered, pointing to where several animals were tied up near the buildings. "At least 4 of them." "So we're outnumbered," Lizzie said calmly. "We've been outnumbered before. That was different. That was a fair fight in the middle of town. This is their territory, their trap." But even as he spoke, Jake was checking his weapons and preparing to move forward. He had sworn an oath to uphold the law and protect innocent people, and that oath didn't include exceptions for when the odds were bad. They moved slowly into the canyon, keeping to whatever cover they could find among the rocks and scrub brush. The sound of their footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the enclosed space, and Jake found himself constantly looking up at the canyon walls, expecting to see rifle barrels pointing down at them. When they were about 50 yards from the mining buildings, a voice called out to them. "That's far enough, Marshal." A man stepped out from behind one of the buildings, a tall, lean individual with long hair and the kind of beard that hadn't been trimmed in months. He was holding a rifle pointed in their direction, and Jake could see at least 2 other men positioned behind various pieces of cover. "You got our message, I see," the man continued. "I'm Billy Black, Caleb's younger brother. And you killed my kin." Jake kept his hands visible but ready to go for his gun. "Your brother was an outlaw and a murderer. He got what was coming to him." "Maybe so," Billy Black replied with a cold smile. "But that doesn't mean I'm going to let you walk away from it." "Where's the gold?" Jake asked. Billy laughed. "Straight to the point, aren't you, Marshal? The gold's safe. And it's going to stay that way unless you and the pretty lady there do exactly what I tell you to do." "Which is?" "First, drop your guns. Both of you." Jake hesitated. Once he gave up his weapons, they would be completely at the mercy of Black's gang. But if he didn't comply, the men with rifles would simply shoot them down where they stood. "Do it," Lizzie said quietly. "We'll find another way." Reluctantly, Jake unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the ground. Lizzie did the same with the small revolver he had given her. "Good," Billy Black said approvingly. "Now walk forward slowly, hands where I can see them." As they approached the mining buildings, more men emerged from their hiding places. Jake counted 5 in total, Billy Black and 4 others, all armed and all looking like the kind of hard cases who would follow an outlaw leader without asking too many questions about right and wrong. "Tie them up," Billy ordered his men. "We'll decide what to do with them after we've had a chance to think about it." 2 of the outlaws approached with lengths of rope. But as they reached for Jake's arms, he suddenly spun around and drove his elbow into the stomach of the nearest man. The outlaw doubled over, gasping for breath, and Jake grabbed for the man's gun. "Jake, look out!" Lizzie screamed. Jake rolled to the side as Billy Black's rifle roared, the bullet striking sparks from the rocks where he had been standing. He came up with the fallen outlaw's pistol and put a bullet into another gang member before the man could bring his own weapon to bear. But then someone struck him from behind with a rifle butt and everything went dark. When Jake woke up, he found himself tied to a post inside one of the mining buildings, with a splitting headache and blood trickling down the back of his neck. Lizzie was tied to another post across from him, and she looked relieved to see him conscious. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I've been better," Jake replied, testing the ropes that bound him. They were tight and well tied. Whoever had done this knew their business. Billy Black was sitting on a wooden crate nearby, cleaning his rifle with the methodical care of a man who depended on his weapons for survival. "Glad to see you're awake, Marshal," Billy said without looking up from his work. "I was starting to worry that Jeb hit you too hard. We need you alive at least for a while." "What do you want, Black?" "What do I want?" Billy's eyes grew hard and cold. "I want my brother back. I want the last 2 years of running and hiding to be over. I want a lot of things I can't have. But what I'll settle for is making you pay for what you did. Your brother made his choices. So did you. Maybe so. But that doesn't change the fact that you're going to die for it." Billy stood up and walked over to where Jake was tied. "The only question is how. See, originally I planned to just shoot you and be done with it. Clean and simple. But then I started thinking about how much trouble you've caused us, how many good men you've killed, and I decided that maybe you deserved something more creative." Jake didn't like the sound of that, but he kept his expression neutral. And the lady? She's done nothing to you. The lady is going to watch, Billy replied with a cruel smile. And then, when you're dead, we'll decide what to do with her. A pretty woman like that could be worth something to the right buyer. Lizzie's face went pale, but she didn't cry or beg. Instead, she looked directly at Billy Black and said, "You're making a mistake." "Am I? How's that?" "You think Jake is just a U.S. Marshal, but you're wrong. He's also working for the railroad company that owned that gold your brother stole. They've put a $10,000 bounty on the head of anyone involved in that robbery." Billy's eyes narrowed. So there are bounty hunters all over this territory looking for you and your men. Professional killers who don't care about legal niceties or taking prisoners. They just want those $10,000. You're lying. Am I? Jake, tell him about the Pinkerton agents. Jake caught on to what Lizzie was doing. She was trying to sow doubt and fear among the outlaws, to make them think that killing him and her wouldn't solve their problems. "She's right," Jake said. "The railroad hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to track down everyone involved in that train robbery. They've got men all over Wyoming and Colorado, and they don't give up." Billy Black was trying to look unconcerned, but Jake could see uncertainty creeping into his eyes. The Pinkerton agents were legendary for their persistence and their ruthlessness. Even hardened outlaws feared them. "Even if that's true," Billy said, "it doesn't change anything. You're still going to die." But Jake could see that it had changed things. Billy was no longer as confident as he had been, and the other gang members were shifting nervously and glancing at each other. "Actually," said a new voice from the entrance to the building, "I think it changes everything." Everyone turned to see a stranger standing in the doorway, a middle-aged man in a dark suit and bowler hat, holding a badge in one hand and a very large pistol in the other. "Pinkerton Detective Agency," the man announced calmly. "You're all under arrest." What happened next was chaos. Billy Black went for his rifle, but the Pinkerton agent's bullet caught him in the chest before he could raise the weapon. The other outlaws scrambled for their guns, but more agents appeared at the windows and in the doorway, their weapons already drawn and ready. The gunfight was brief and decisive. When the smoke cleared, 3 of the outlaws were dead and 2 were wounded and surrendering. The stolen railroad gold was recovered from where it had been hidden in the mine shaft, and Jake and Lizzie were free. Marshal Morrison, the lead Pinkerton agent, said as he untied Jake's bonds, "I'm Detective Samuel Hayes. We've been tracking this gang for months." "How did you find us?" "We've been watching the mining camps, figuring that sooner or later the gang would come back for the gold. When we saw the smoke from your campfire last night, we knew something was happening." As Jake rubbed the circulation back into his wrists, he looked over at Lizzie, who was being untied by another agent. "That was quick thinking back there," he told her, telling them about the Pinkertons. "I didn't know there really were Pinkertons," Lizzie admitted with a shaky laugh. "I was just trying to buy us some time." Well, it worked. As the sun set over Devil's Canyon, Jake and Lizzie rode back toward Silver Creek with the Pinkerton agents and their prisoners. The nightmare that had begun with Caleb Black's gang was finally over. But for Jake and Lizzie, another story was just beginning. 1 month later, Jake and Lizzie stood on the platform of the Silver Creek train station. But this time the circumstances were very different from when she had first arrived. The bounty money from capturing Black's gang had been substantial, enough to give them both a fresh start wherever they wanted to make it. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked, adjusting the collar of his new suit. He looked handsome and respectable, though Lizzie thought he would always look a little dangerous around the eyes. "I'm sure," Lizzie replied, smoothing the skirt of her wedding dress, a beautiful white gown that Mrs. Henderson had helped her order from a catalog. "The question is, are you sure? A month ago you were a bachelor U.S. Marshal with no ties to anyone. Now you're about to become a married man with a farm to run." "I'm sure," Jake said firmly. "I've spent enough years chasing outlaws. It's time to build something instead of just tearing things down." They had decided to use the reward money to buy a small ranch outside of Silver Creek, not Samuel Whitmore's burned-out place, but a nice spread with good water and fertile soil. Jake planned to raise cattle and horses, while Lizzie looked forward to having a garden and maybe some chickens. It wasn't the life either of them had originally planned, but it was the life they had chosen together. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Samuel Whitmore had lived?" Lizzie asked as they waited for the preacher to arrive on the morning train. "If I had married him like I was supposed to?" Jake considered the question seriously. "I think you would have been a good wife to him and he would have been a good husband to you. But I don't think you would have been as happy as you're going to be with me." "Why not?" "Because Samuel was a good man, but he was a settled man. A safe man. And I think you're discovering that you're not really a settled, safe kind of woman. Lizzie laughed. A month ago I would have been insulted by that. Now I think it might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said about me. The train whistle echoed across the prairie, announcing the arrival of the 9:15 from Cheyenne. Among the passengers stepping down onto the platform was Reverend Thomas, a circuit preacher who traveled between the small towns of Wyoming Territory performing weddings, baptisms, and funerals as needed. Marshall Morrison? Miss Harper. The Reverend was a kindly-looking man in his 50s, with gray hair and eyes that had seen both the best and worst of frontier life. I understand you folks want to get married today. Yes, sir, Jake replied. If it's not too much trouble. No trouble at all. I always enjoy a happy occasion. Shall we proceed to the church? The Silver Creek Community Church was a simple wooden building with a bell tower and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the pews. It wasn't a grand cathedral like the churches Lizzie had known in Boston, but it felt warm and welcoming. Most of the town had turned out for the wedding. There was Mrs. Henderson from the hotel, Mr. Johnson from the general store, Tom Brady the saloon keeper, and dozens of other faces that had become familiar over the past month. For a woman who had arrived in Silver Creek as a stranger with nowhere to go, Lizzie felt remarkably like she was surrounded by friends and family. The ceremony itself was simple but moving. Jake and Lizzie exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to love, honor, and protect each other through whatever adventures life might bring. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the whole congregation erupted in cheers and applause. At the reception that followed in the hotel dining room, Tom Brady stood up to make a toast. To Jake and Lizzie Morrison, he said, raising his glass of whiskey. Jake came to our town as a lawman doing his duty, and Lizzie came as a mail-order bride looking for a new life. Neither of them got what they expected, but I think they got something better. They got each other and they got a place in our community. Here's to love, adventure, and the courage to face both. Hear, hear, the crowd responded, drinking to the toast. Later, as the sun was setting over the prairie, Jake and Lizzie stood outside their new home, a modest house on the ranch they had purchased, with a view of the mountains in the distance and room for all the dreams they were planning to build together. Do you ever miss Boston? Jake asked, slipping his arm around his wife's waist. Sometimes I miss the libraries, Lizzie admitted, and the theater. But I don't miss the crowded streets or the factory, or feeling like I was invisible in the crowd. And I miss the excitement of the chase sometimes, Jake said. But I don't miss sleeping on the ground and never knowing if someone was trying to kill me. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars come out in the vast western sky. In the distance, they could hear the lonesome call of a coyote and the gentle lowing of their cattle settling down for the night. Jake, Lizzie said finally, do you think we'll have a boring life now? Now that we're not chasing outlaws or being shot at by desperados? Jake considered the question seriously. Well, let's see. We're starting a ranch in Wyoming Territory, where there are still wild Indians, cattle rustlers, harsh winters, and the occasional tornado. You're a Boston girl learning to be a frontier wife, and I'm a former lawman learning to be a farmer. Our nearest neighbors are 10 miles away, and the closest doctor is in Cheyenne. So you're saying no, it probably won't be boring. I'm saying that if our life gets boring, we're not trying hard enough. Lizzie laughed and leaned against her husband's strong shoulder. I love you, Jake Morrison. I love you too, Elizabeth Morrison. And I think we're going to have quite an adventure together. As if to emphasize his point, a shooting star streaked across the sky above them, bright and beautiful and gone in an instant, just like the moment when their eyes had first met on the train platform in Silver Creek, when they had both been looking for one thing and found something entirely different and infinitely better. The Morrison Ranch had grown and prospered in the 5 years since Jake and Lizzie's wedding. What had started as a small spread with a few head of cattle had become one of the most successful ranches in the territory, known for its fine horses and the integrity of its owners. Jake had proven to be a natural rancher, combining his knowledge of the land gained during his years as a marshal with a talent for understanding animals that surprised even him. Lizzie had thrown herself into frontier life with the same determination she had once applied to factory work, learning everything from preserving food for the winter to delivering foals in the middle of the night. On this particular morning in late spring, Lizzie stood in the doorway of their expanded house, watching Jake work with a particularly spirited young stallion in the corral. At her side, 2-year-old Samuel Morrison, named for the man whose death had brought them together, tugged at her skirt and babbled in the universal language of toddlers. Dada. Samuel pointed excitedly at his father, who was patiently teaching the stallion to accept a bridle. Yes, that's Daddy, Lizzie agreed, shifting baby Mary to her other hip. Mary was just 6 months old, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's brown eyes, and she was already showing signs of the adventurous spirit that seemed to run in the Morrison family. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Lizzie look up from her children. A rider was coming up the long drive to their house, a young man in a badge and official-looking clothes who looked familiar. "Jake," she called. "We have company." Jake handed the stallion's lead rope to one of his ranch hands and walked over to meet the visitor, brushing dust from his hands as he went. The rider turned out to be Deputy Marshal Tom Garrett, who had worked with Jake during his law enforcement days. "Tom," Jake said with genuine pleasure, shaking the younger man's hand. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Official business, I'm afraid," Tom replied, though he smiled as he tipped his hat to Lizzie and admired the children. "How are you folks doing? You look like ranching agrees with you." "It does," Jake said simply. "What's this official business about?" Tom's expression grew serious. "There's been a series of bank robberies across the territory. Professional jobs, well-planned and well-executed. The descriptions of the gang members match some men we thought were dead, associates of Caleb Black who supposedly died in that gunfight up in Montana last year." Jake frowned. "Are you saying some of Black's old gangs survived and are back in business?" "That's what it looks like." "And Jake?" Tom hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. "They've been asking questions about you and your wife. About the Morrison Ranch." Lizzie felt a chill run down her spine. She had hoped that their adventures with outlaws and desperados were a thing of the past. "What kind of questions?" Jake asked, his voice taking on the hard edge that Lizzie remembered from their early days together. "Where you live, how many hands you employ, whether you still carry a gun. The kind of questions men ask when they're planning something unpleasant." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Lizzie could see him thinking through the implications. Their peaceful life, their children's safety, their carefully built prosperity, all of it could be threatened by ghosts from his past as a lawman. "What do you need from me?" Jake asked finally. "The territorial governor has authorized me to offer you a temporary appointment as a deputy U.S. Marshal. We need someone with your experience and knowledge of Black's gang to help track down these new robberies." "And if I refuse?" Tom shrugged uncomfortably. "Then we'll do our best without you." "But Jake, these men are dangerous and they seem to have a personal grudge against you. You might be safer helping us catch them than waiting for them to come to you." Lizzie stepped forward, still holding baby Mary. "How long would this appointment last?" "Probably a few months. Maybe less if we get lucky." "And Jake would be traveling, chasing these outlaws across the territory?" "Some of the time, yes ma'am. But we'd also make sure your ranch was well protected while he was gone." Lizzie looked at her husband, seeing the conflict in his eyes. She knew he wanted to refuse, wanted to stay with his family and his peaceful life. But she also knew that Jake Morrison had never been a man to run from danger, especially when innocent people were being threatened. "What do you think?" Jake asked her quietly. "I think," Lizzie said slowly, "that we've been very happy for 5 years and we'll be happy again when this is over. But right now there are people who need help, and you're the man who can provide it." Jake smiled at her, the same smile that had made her heart skip a beat in the middle of a gunfight all those years ago. "Are you sure? It means leaving you alone with the children and the ranch." "I won't be alone. We have good hands working here and the people in Silver Creek will help if I need it. Besides," she added with a grin, "I'm not the same helpless mail-order bride who stepped off the train 5 years ago. I can take care of myself and our children." "No," Jake agreed, "you certainly are not." Tom Garrett looked relieved. "Then you'll take the appointment?" "I'll take it," Jake said. "But I have conditions. First, I want extra men posted here at the ranch while I'm gone, not just to protect my family, but because if these outlaws really are planning something against me personally, they might try to get to me through my wife and children." "Agreed." "Second, I want to bring my own partner on this assignment." "Who did you have in mind?" Jake grinned. "My wife." Both Tom and Lizzie stared at him in surprise. "Jake," Lizzie said slowly, "I have 2 small children to take care of. And Mrs. Henderson has been saying for months that she'd love to spend more time with little Samuel and Mary. She's practically their grandmother already. But I don't know anything about being a deputy marshal. You know how to shoot, how to track, how to think like a criminal, and how to keep your head in dangerous situations. That's more than most deputies start with." Tom Garrett looked uncertain. "I'm not sure the territorial government would approve of appointing a woman as a deputy marshal." "Then don't tell them she's a woman," Jake said calmly. "Appointee Morrison as my partner. They don't need to know that the stands for Elizabeth." It was an outrageous plan, But as Lizzie thought about it, she found herself getting excited rather than frightened. The past 5 years had been wonderful, but she had to admit that sometimes she missed the adventure, the sense of making a real difference in the world. "I'd have to cut my hair," she said thoughtfully, "and learn to dress like a man." "You'd have to do more than that," Jake warned. "You'd have to learn to act like a man, talk like a man, think like a man. It would be dangerous, and if anyone figured out who you really were, they'd think you were crazy for bringing your wife along on a dangerous assignment," Lizzie finished. "Which you probably are." "Probably," Jake agreed cheerfully. Tom Garrett shook his head in amazement. "You two are either the bravest people I've ever met or the craziest. Maybe both." "We prefer to think of ourselves as practical," Lizzie said. "Jake needs a partner he can trust absolutely, and I need to know that the man I love isn't riding off into danger without someone to watch his back. And if we're both involved in stopping these outlaws," Jake added, "we can make sure they're stopped permanently, instead of just scattered to cause trouble somewhere else." 2 weeks later, Deputy U.S. Marshal Jake Morrison and his partner, Deputy E. Morrison, rode out of Silver Creek on the trail of the bank robbers. To anyone watching, they looked like two young men heading off on official business. But Lizzie Morrison, now disguised as Eddie Morrison, knew that they were really a husband and wife team setting off on what might be their greatest adventure yet. As they rode toward the distant mountains where the outlaws were believed to be hiding, Jake reached over and squeezed her gloved hand. "Any regrets?" he asked. "About leaving the children with Mrs. Henderson, or about cutting off all my hair, or about pretending to be a man? About any of it?" Eddie, grinned at him from under the brim of her hat. "Ask me again in a few months when we've caught the bad guys and saved the territory from a life of crime. And if we don't catch them? Then we'll go down fighting side by side just like we always have." Jake laughed. "I love you, Elizabeth Morrison." "I love you too, Jake Morrison. Now come on, we have outlaws to catch." They spurred their horses into a gallop and rode off toward the horizon, ready for whatever adventure awaited them. Behind them, the Morrison Ranch stood peaceful and prosperous in the morning sun, a symbol of what they had built together and what they would always have to come home to. But ahead of them lay the vast wilderness of the American West, still wild and dangerous and full of possibilities for those brave enough to face them. The mail-order bride who had fallen for the wrong cowboy, or perhaps exactly the right cowboy, was heading off on another adventure, and she had never been happier.